This is our last session of the day, and we're changing up the format a little bit, and we hope you all stay for the reception. To keep it is the last session of the day, and we know you can be, you've been seeing so much excitement today, you might be a little worn down, even with these great speakers we have that are about to come. So we're going to give you something a little interactive to do, and Eitan from Microsoft Pulse, who has been who we've been very lucky to have as a sponsor for this event, is going to tell you about that for just a brief minute, and then Shannon will introduce our speakers.
So we're going to make the session a little bit more interactive and engaging, and you're going to have the chance to vote on each of the Lightning talks. At the end, we're going to tell you which Lightning talk came on top, that you agreed to with the most, and we'll stand crack you guys. So welcome to the era of digital content rating. So go to aka.ms/Harvard. The Wi-Fi works better than your cell reception in this room, and the vote will keep pinging for about 30 seconds. You can shift it whenever you want, but to make it easy on you, we've make it a little automatic, and we'll get started in a moment. Yes.
No self-voting. Hi, I'm Shannon McGregor. I'm a PhD student at the University of Texas at Austin, and I study political communication, kind of the intersection of that with social media, gender, and public opinion. So I'm loving the 2016 election, just as a researcher. So I want to introduce this last lightning talk to you guys. There's no moderator, there's no Q&A. This is quick and awesome, and then we are out to socialize. So first up, we have Brendan Nyhan, who's an assistant professor of government at Dartmouth and a contributor to the New York Times Upshot. Kerry Sheffield is the founder of the new media company Bold and has written for Washington Post, The Politico, Hill, and Forbes. Harry Enten is a senior political writer and analyst for FiveThirtyEight and covered the 2012 election for The Guardian. Jeremy Bird is a founding partner of 270 Strategies, a grassroots organizing firm, which he launched after serving as the national field director for Obama's 2012 re-election campaign. Natalie Jackson has put her PhD in political science to work as a senior polling editor at Huffington Post and runs the Pollster section of the site. And Eitan Hersh is an assistant professor of political science at Yale, the author of Hacking the Electorate, and an expert in campaign strategy, voting behavior, information technology and politics, and election administration. So without further ado, enjoy and vote.
All right, thanks very much. Well, we've got to go quickly with the 5-minute talk. So I'm Brendan Nyhan, and what I'd like to talk to you about today is the science of fact-checking. That's an issue that's come up a lot in this campaign. And what I want to convince you of in 5 minutes is the need for a realistic perspective on what fact-checking can or can't do, and to hopefully show you that science can help us understand exactly what the boundaries of that effect might be. Okay? So we've tended to oscillate between two extremes in the debate over the role of facts in politics and the effects of fact-checking. On the one hand, we've seen this explosion in journalistic fact-checking of political candidates, and that's been lauded as an incredibly important development in political journalism that might hold politicians accountable for the accuracy of their statements more systematically than ever before. Okay? And so people have been very excited about the potential of fact-checking, but then we often move to the other extreme where people say, oh no, facts don't matter at all, right? So this is a Time magazine cover in 2012 about the fact wars between the Obama and Romney campaigns. Now, of course, this pattern has continued in 2016. You knew there were going to be Trump slides. There are Trump slides. Can Donald Trump be fact-checked? And for instance, the poor, hardworking people at Politico wrote down, went through a transcript of a week of Trump statements and found a misstatement approximately every 5 minutes, right? So there's a kind of volume problem that's happening. And that spurred this larger conversation where people are having a crisis of confidence. They're worried that fact-checking doesn't matter. It can't stop political falsehood, okay? And what I want to argue to you is that that's the wrong way to think about it. So you see statements like this all the time. So here in 2012 is David Carr saying the politicians make claims that aren't true, and they just keep right on saying them. Right? Jack Schaefer in Politico writing about this campaign, saying you would think Trump's campaign would have imploded, would hobble his candidacy to see documentation of his lies, but in fact has had little or no effect. And the argument I want to make to you is that these are the wrong standards for thinking about the effects of fact-checking. Okay? The idea that fact-checking could magically make politicians stop saying things that aren't true or convince everybody that the falsehoods are in fact false is unreasonable. It's the wrong counterfactual. What you want to think about instead is, how would things be if we didn't have fact-checking at all? That's the correct counterfactual. And the answer, I think, is probably worse, right? That's what you want to be thinking about when you're thinking about the effects of fact-checking. Think of a world where Donald Trump wasn't being fact-checked at all, right? It's probably hard to imagine what he could do to up the ante further in terms of falsehoods, but maybe we'd see it. And more generally, right, we should think more generally about what effect fact-checking has on politicians in general, okay? Now, we can bring science to this question, okay? So in my own research with Jason Reifler, we found that fact-checking can be ineffective. Okay, so I do think we should take seriously the notion that fact-checking may not work. We shouldn't assume that it works. We should try to validate that it works. And in some cases, in extreme cases like this, it can actually make the problem worse for the group that's most vulnerable to the misperception in question. Okay, so I do think we need to take seriously the idea that fact-checking isn't a panacea. Okay? But at the same time, there are reasons to think fact-checking can be important and effective in a democratic system. Okay? So here's research that Jason and I conducted looking at the effect of fact-checking on state legislators. Okay? And what we found is that when we reminded a large sample of state legislators of the threat to their reputation and political prospects posed by fact-checking, they were less likely to have the accuracy of their statements questioned, which we took as at least indirect evidence that they were being more responsible in the public statements that they were making. So fact-checking may play a very important role in holding elites accountable, even if it's not necessarily persuading the hardcore. Okay? So fact-checking may be an important factor in holding politicians accountable, even if it can't stop Donald Trump, in other words. Okay? And we shouldn't think about that. We should realize that presidential candidates are likely to be the hardest to politicians for our fact-checking to affect. Okay, one final point. Okay, fact-checking can be effective. Okay, and there are ways we can learn about, using science, what sorts of approaches in fact-checking are most effective. So these are some recommendations from my own research of some do's and don'ts for the journalists in the room that might make your fact-checking more effective. But let me end with one piece of evidence from some new research that I've done, again with Jason Reifler. In the 2014 campaign, we randomly exposed a nationally representative sample to a series of fact checks during the fall general election campaign. Okay? And we asked people after the election about the content of those fact checks. And we actually improved the accuracy of their beliefs quite substantially by about a 9 percentage point improvement. Okay? But that's relative to a 16 percentage point base of the accuracy of their beliefs. So we think that's pretty substantial. We think that means that we shouldn't give up hope on fact checking after all. So thanks.
Can you guys hear me all right? Hello, everybody. I'm Kerry Sheffield. We're playing musical chairs. Excited to be here. I'm the founder, as has been said, of a website called Bold. Do me a solid, go to bold.global. That's our domain. .com is so 20th century. So we're here. So we're new generation media. We're Bold. This is just a background. We are looking to be a viral news culture platform for, you can read the official language. Unofficially, basically, we're trying to be almost like a Mic.com, but for moderate conservatives, basically. I also like to call us the Wall Street Journal for everybody else. Speaking of data, your average Wall Street Journal reader is an old, white, rich, urban man. Speaking of data again, this is the current media landscape according to Pew with self-identified people along the political spectrum. The panel just before me set things up brilliantly for what we're trying to do as far as, trying to pull in the far right and to dialogue with the moderate left. There's a huge, as they say, blue ocean in startup land. You want to go where the blue ocean is, not where the red ocean is. That's bloody, and there's lots of sharks. There's lots of sharks over there to the left of the average respondent, and there's lots of sharks over there to the far right. And we're really trying to be there in the center-right ecosystem. This is our founding team. You can read more about us. There's our website, bold.global. We launched on November 30th, which was Winston Churchill's birthday, a big hero of mine. We have started with a range of news as well as opinion. You can see we've got 7 verticals, not just politics, but tech, business, food, style, etc. And we've been piloting a talk show that we're basically, the concept behind it is to try to reverse the math of Morning Joe, which is 1 conservative and 4 liberals. We're turning that out on its head. Or what did I say? It's 1 liberal and 4 conservatives, basically. The model is similar to HuffPost or Forbes, where I'm a contributor as well. Just thinking about everybody on a spectrum in terms of content creation, a full-time content creator and a part-time content creator. And that's across format, video, blog, etc., social media. This is something also that we're really tracking in terms of how we approach TV. So I know we have a number of people. I was just talking with Perry about cable news and how there's basically your average Fox viewer is age 68 years old. So if we really want to engage young people, it's not going to be through this method, through linear TV. And so all the data is showing that millennials are dropping out in terms of the traditional TV programming. And so with Bold, we're piloting a lot of, as they say, OTT, over-the-top video strategies. This is an interesting breakdown of BuzzFeed. BuzzFeed has been a very successful digital millennial platform. This is from Andreessen Horowitz, which is a major multi-billion-dollar investment fund out in Silicon Valley, which just put $50 million into BuzzFeed. And this is the breakout of where BuzzFeed's traffic is coming from. So they are platform agnostic, and most of their traffic is not coming directly to the site, which is very interesting. This is where Bold aspires to be. This is a conceptual TV guide of the future, and Bold, we plan to be there. And we plan to be on mobile. We are very involved in Harlem. The company was founded in Harlem. One of our founding advisors is the founder of a group called Silicon Harlem. On April 7th, a professor is sending one of his representatives, which is exciting. We are co-sponsoring a debate in Harlem for the seat that is going to be vacated by Charlie Ringel, who is retiring after 45 years. We're co-moderating. I'm one of the co-moderators along with MTV and MSNBC. So we are really trying to bring about Harlem Renaissance 2.0 by having conversations with people that conservatives have been ignoring for 50 years, basically, since the Southern State Strategy, which I think was totally flawed and racist. So, so this is just to end, this is Zora Neale Hurston. A lot of people know her from the original Harlem Renaissance, but a lot of people don't know that she was also conservative. So we're really trying to unearth some of these lost voices and bring people to the table who have not been talking for the past 50 years. That's Bold.
You keep her on. It's a nice picture in the background. Great author. I don't have any slides, and I also don't have a clock or, I heard that you were going to get to vote by phone, but I personally think that's biased because this is my phone, and I don't know how you expect me to vote on something that looks like this, to be perfectly honest, but all right. So I got 5 minutes, but I have no idea how that's being counted and whatnot.
There's a clock.
Oh, there's a clock, an old-fashioned clock up there, so that'll give me a rough idea. It's the 5, and it'll go to the 10. I think I can tell time. So I'm Harry, and work at FiveThirtyEight. And one of the things that we do at FiveThirtyEight, obviously, is we have these demographic models. We have this, that, and other, all these fancy statistics. But at the end of the day, one of the things that really informs what we're doing is the polling data, right? And supposedly this year is this great new year. We have all these new types of polls that are out there. And indeed, if you look nationally at those national primary polls, which of course tell us absolutely nothing for the most part, you'll see that 45% of the polls now are being conducted via the internet mostly. Live interview polls are only, I believe, 40%, and automated phones, those dial, touch-tone, keypad things that Homer Simpson once used in one of those episodes to be annoying, are down to 15%. And indeed, the internet is up from, I believe, 20% 4 years ago, so that's a 25 percentage point jump. And while the live interview polls are dropping significantly from 65 all the way down to just 40. And that, to me, seems like a really big deal. In fact, if you look at the major news organizations, you see a lot of them are adopting these more internet-style samples. So, for instance, NBC News, and I know we have a representative from that organization somewhere in the audience who's currently looking at his phone right now. SurveyMonkey, is being part of NBC News, but they still, however, don't use internet polls for their statewide samples. In fact, there's only one major news organization that does that. Does anyone want to guess what that one is? I wonder if Anthony's still here. I think he might have a decent idea if he's here, but I don't. Maybe he went back to New York because, let's face it, New York is better than Boston. This is the point where you rate me down in your polling. CBS News is the only, in fact, pollster who uses internet polls for their statewide samples. And indeed, if you look at the statewide samples, supposedly this is, live interview polls are going out, everything is going bad, no. In fact, live interview polls of the state primary polls 4 years ago made up only 45% of the polls that were being used, about 45%. I'm using general numbers here. And this year, what's the percentage? In fact, it's up to 55%. So the polls that you're looking at in Wisconsin, for instance, the polls that we're kind of relying on, Fox Business, the Fox News poll came out last night, the Marquette poll, which is run by Charles Franklin, who I am using in this talk as a model because I remember he came up to Dartmouth and he used no slides whatsoever, and people seem to like that. They told me I was second best in that panel, and he was number one, so I figured this one I'll reach myself up by not using any slides. Charles Franklin's poll, live interviewer poll. And indeed, if you look across all of these states, live interview polls seem to be the most dominant. It's the type of stuff that we would look at. I mean, Nate Cohn, who's right up there, who's the summer me. He likes hurricanes, I like snowstorms. We tend to look at these automated polls that are done by PPP, and we don't really trust them. We instead are looking at these live interview polls. And so to me, the real question going forward, as we kind of go into the next 4 years, 8 years, whatever, elections in the United States are not done nationally. It's not like, the person who wins the popular vote of the well, obviously, if you lived through 2000, even though I'm getting a little old and I realize college students are younger and younger and younger and younger and younger, I don't think any of you were not at least alive for the 2000 election, unless we have someone like David Shore who's up there who at one point was working on statistics when he was like 15 because he's amazing. But the general point is that state-by-state elections are the way we do things. And at least in terms of that, we're still using this old technology. And I wonder, as a member of the media and kind of looking forward, whether or not we're actually ever really going to shift, especially in primaries and statewide primaries, where these internet polls really don't have these samples that are necessary to really understand what's going to happen, these opt-in samples. There simply aren't enough people in them. We don't know how to weight them. That's a big problem. Weighting is a big thing in primaries, especially low turnout. When Donald Trump is off the ballot, for instance, I can assure you in these state-run primaries that you're not going to get a lot of people very interested in voting for Secretary of State of Missouri, although Jason Kander is a perfectly nice gentleman. So I really do wonder what's going to happen. Where are we going to go forward? And I don't know the answer to that because this year is supposedly the year in which, data analytics is so great and everything is moving forward. Indeed, we haven't really moved forward at all. In fact, if anything, we've kind of moved a little bit backwards, in which live interview polls, which are supposedly something of the past, are now making up 55% as opposed to 45% of the polls that they did 4 years earlier. And with that, I believe my clock is hit about, I think I've hit that time, right? Yeah. So there we go. I'll shut up, and we can all get the hell out of here and get some drinks.
So I have to start by apologizing. The last panel talked about Joe the plumber leading to Donald Trump, and I actually was the one who cut the turf in Ohio in 2008 that sent the president to the neighborhood where Joe the plumber was. And I actually want to talk about that. So I come to this topic of the future of campaigns from the perspective of a campaign practitioner, and particularly from the perspective of an organizer. And I like to think about what will it look like for a campaign manager in 2020, 2024, or hell, 2036, when you're thinking about what does a campaign look like. And I actually think, and I'm glad you're doing the voting on this, but I actually think I'm only going to focus on one piece. There's a lot of things that will be the same, right? We're still going to be talking about, do we have the right candidate with the right message at the right time? We're still going to be talking about, as a campaign, how do I put together a winning coalition to make it a choice between my candidate and the other candidates with a series of different things? How do I register, persuade, and then turn out my supporters? Hopefully, we won't be having the same conversations we're having about registration, but that's for a topic for another day. We could talk about automatic voter registration at another time. But the question is, how do I do that in the future, particularly from the organizing side of campaigns. So when I worked on Carrie's campaign in 2004, our phone contact rate, when we picked up the phone number that was attached to a voter on the list that we talked about earlier, those contact rates were in the 30s. In 2008, when I made phone calls as an organizer, those contact rates were in the 20%. In 2012, it was in the teens, and this year it's in the single digits. So if I'm going to run a campaign and I want to reach out to my voters, I have to figure out where to find them. And this device is fundamentally changing that. So on the one hand, you have those contact rates going down. On the other hand, when I started working for Barack Obama in the South Carolina primary in 2007, smartphones were about 6% of the cell phone market. By the time that election were over, they were 11% of the cell phone market. When I worked for him in 2012, 45% of every adult American had a smartphone. This year, it's about 70%. It fundamentally changes the way that people are communicating, and therefore it has to fundamentally change the way that we're organizing. It should fundamentally change the way that we think about budgets, the way that we think about campaign staff, and definitely the way that we think about organizing. In the future, I believe, there will no longer be, especially on presidential campaigns, there will no longer be a digital organizing department and a field department. It doesn't make sense anymore. There will be an organizing department by which we will set organizers' goals based on what they're doing and how they're reaching people, where they're talking to their friends, their neighbors, their family, which is on their phone. And so you already see this now with the way that Sanders is organizing. You already see this with the way that Clinton is organizing. Their organizers on the Clinton campaign have metrics that are about their conversations with people, not on the phone, but on Twitter, on Facebook, on email, on text. It's fundamentally changing the way in which campaigns are run. But what does it also mean? It also means we need to go to the doors, because we are still going to have to both do it online but also offline and talk to people and have those face-to-face conversations. But those conversations at the doors, I think, are going to be fundamentally different. The reason that they're going to be different is I no longer have to go to the door with a clipboard and one script. I now go to the doors with a phone, and I can now get actual real-time immediate data on that conversation. I can have a personalized script, and I can have visual in terms of my conversation. Or in the case of what we saw in the last cycle in India, potentially I can have the candidate actually there with me in a hologram. But that's for maybe 30s, et cetera. But I actually think for all of you who really care about data analytics, I think the idea of immediate information coming back from those conversations fundamentally changes the way campaigns are run. Right now, the way that we do research on campaigns, we still do focus groups, we still do polling, and we still have this issue of how do we actually have conversations, the online mix, the offline, the landline, the cell phone. But if I'm running a campaign, particularly at the presidential level in 2020, 2024, I should have hundreds of thousands of data points, or at least thousands of data points every day about how my message is working with what individual voters in real time. I don't have to call the pollster and say, when am I going to get that poll back next week? I don't have to wait on the focus group data. I can get that data in real time to make decisions. And for all of you, I believe that that leads to the end of guru politics in many ways. And what we've seen in the last couple of cycles in presidential campaign headquarters is right next to the campaign manager, in addition to the ad geniuses and the folks that do that kind of strategy, you see the chief analytics officer. And I think you will see that person more and more. They used to be in the back room. They started to get into the 8:30 meeting setting strategy the last couple of cycles. And I believe they're going to be right there with the campaign manager making decisions in real time because of the way in which we are going to communicate with voters. We're going to get that data back immediately. We're going to be able to test ads immediately. That technology already exists. Why do we have to go to a focus group and wait for what people think about our ads? I can show the ad right now on my phone and get a much, much larger sample. And I believe that also can potentially lead to the democratization of data, but that's also for another day.
Hi, I'm Natalie. I work for Huffington Post. As they said, I am now coordinating the Pollster site. If you haven't quite been paying attention for the last few months, yes, Mark Blumenthal used to run it. He and Charles Franklin co-created Pollster. Mark moved on in October. If you want to have your life turned upside down, have someone hand you an entire section of a website in October before an election year. But we're doing great. He left a great team in place. We're doing really well. But one thing that I spend a lot of time thinking about that I'd like to focus on in my limited time here is how we communicate with people. How do we in the media communicate our data to the mass public? People pay attention to what we say really once every 4 years. So not to steal too much if there are any Hamilton fans, we probably shouldn't throw away our shot. So I spend a lot of time thinking about this. The hinge point of where political data meets the public is through a poll. Not surprising, we've talked about polls off and on all day. But people don't like polls anymore. They used to. But I like to joke with my friends that people really don't like the media, and they really don't like polls. So it makes it really fun to work at the intersection of hated and hated. So you can imagine the email. And most of it deals with just fundamental trust issues with polls. So how do we address this? I work at Huffington Post. We have the potential for a very large audience coming to Pollster. But we have to get them away from sex tips and the Kardashians. So if I'm not completely upfront in the way I'm doing things, they're gonna just completely write me off. So I've become a huge advocate for transparency. One of the biggest issues I think that we have in data and data analytics is how transparent we are with our data and what we tell people about what we do. And so for Pollster, what we're working on, it'll be a longer term project than 2016, but the general concept is that if you don't publicly put out how you did your poll, especially as polling gets more complex, then we're not going to trust your data and we're not going to put you in our database to imply that our users should trust you. And I think that's a larger point that we should make about data and communicating things to the public is if we're not upfront about what we're doing and how we're modeling and what we're doing behind the scenes, why should they trust us? So my point here is that we have to have standards. Because we owe it to our readers, we can't throw away our shot. I'll use that tired metaphor again. I guess it's only tired if you've been listening to Hamilton for the last year. And you can't talk to them in a bunch of statistical gobbledygook. You need to speak in plain English, explain what you're doing, and maybe by doing that, we'll be able to restore some of the public trust in polling data, which is the biggest part of what they see when they come to politics and find data. So I will stop there, and you should vote for me because I went an entire 5 minutes without mentioning the T name.
Hi, everybody. I guess I'll finish off here. I'm going to talk and try to end with a fairly big picture point about competition in American politics. There's been a lot of stability in partisan competition in the last bunch of election cycles. We've gotten used to stability. By stability, I mean the candidates who are running for office, for president, and for congressional elections have stayed pretty close to their own party brands, to their party platforms. And the voters have been extremely loyal. In the last few election cycles, voters for each party have voted for their party's candidates like 90% of the time, right? So there's a partisan loyalty among the voters, divergence and consistency among the candidates, and there are consequences for this stability in electoral politics. What are those consequences? First of all, there's been basically the same set of swing states, battleground states, the last few election years. We all know them. Probably everyone in this room knows what Cuyahoga County means, which is a weird thing. And so we're used to that. There's also, we know congressional elections mostly uncompetitive, but there's this few set of congressional elections, congressional districts that are competitive. We also know in the last few election cycles, particularly in the Obama years, the strategy in the general election has been about turning out the base. No one's persuadable. The party affiliates are loyal. So the parties, particularly the Democratic Party, just focus on mobilizing these low turnout base supporters. Okay? So that's the conventional view of this stability. And I just want to show you some data, a map, to suggest that there's a lot of latent potential for competition in American politics that's really pretty striking. This is a map from a new paper that Bernard Fraga and I just released. You can find it online. And while you're looking at this map, let me show you what it is, okay? We looked at, in this map, just 4 election cycles, 2006, 2008, 2010, 2012. And we looked up and down the ballot, the president, congressional races, Senate races, gubernatorial races, state legislative races. And in dark gray is any area that saw a super competitive race at least once. Okay? This is not a primary, not municipal elections, just a general election between Democrats and Republicans. If it's a dark gray area, they saw a race that had less than a 5-point margin between the Democrat and Republican. At one point between 2006 and 2012. Okay? The light gray is areas that saw at least a 10-point margin. It's like a 55-45 race, also pretty close. And the white areas are the areas in the country that have seen no competitive race in this 4-cycle period. Okay? And so what should be striking to you, given this image of a few battleground states and the rest of the country is just like this competitive drought land, is that 90% of Americans live in a place that has seen a really competitive partisan election in this period between 2006 and 2012, which is a highly polarized years, right? You can see the areas that haven't had this competition, but the real story here is that Northeast, South, Midwest, West, most of the places in the country have had this kind of competition. And this period is not unusual. This is a 100-year period, 50 cycles. We've, for each state, said just for the statewide elections, the Senate, governor, and the presidential election at the state level, what is the longest number of elections a state has ever gone in 100 years without a competitive statewide race? So, right, four states have never gone more than 2 cycles without a competitive race. And about half the states in the country have never in 100 years gone more than 4 cycles without a competitive statewide race. The only states that have gone really long periods I've highlighted because we know the obvious reason here, right? There's these southern states that in the period before civil rights had no competition between Democrats and Republicans. But aside from that, every state basically regularly has competition. Okay, why does this happen? Well, it happens in part because there's short-term waves, right? In 2010, which was a good year for Republicans, even here in Massachusetts had a competitive gubernatorial election, a competitive senatorial election, 2 competitive congressional elections. In 2008, which is a good year for Democrats, Alabama had competitive state congressional elections in 2 districts, 2 white Democrats won in Alabama. Okay, so there's the potential for competition there. And there's also a lot of potential for competition for for a reason that we all know, which is that parties find a way to be competitive. They find a way to speak to that median voter. And so the point I want to make, and I hope this is a useful point as we close the session, is that we've had just a little bit of competition with stability. And as in this coming election, we see maybe new kinds of cleavages within parties, we might be able to see that the whole country, or much of the country, really has the potential to be quite competitive. Thanks.
Truth.
Well, the good news is that your favorability ratings are better than Congress's and the president's, because everyone was above 50%. So I'll start with the most provocative point. It was a very hurtful joke. Thank you, Harry. But people don't think that New York is better than Boston. So that was
What a surprise.
The point that engaged 75 of you, and they didn't react very favorably. And then Jeremy won the contest, and people really liked the point about digital and field coming together and the increasing role of the chief analytics officer. So that scored the highest. Well, but thank you, everyone.
It's like real-time results. Can you give us like our little code and say like,
Take that with you.
Well, that concludes the conference today, and I just wanted to say a really special thank you again to Kirk and Ryan for putting all this together. It was a lot of work and a great vision, and we look forward to next year. So thank you, Kirk and Ryan.